Units of the Naval Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine carried out a precise missile strike with Neptune cruise missiles on the Oryol thermal power plant and the Novo-Bryansk electrical substation. Both facilities supplied electricity to Russian military enterprises. Disabling them dealt a serious blow to the logistics of the Russian occupiers. The thermal power plant supplies about 40% of the electricity needs of the Oryol region, while the Novo-Bryansk substation is among the 5 largest energy facilities in the Central Federal District. 94 combat clashes have been recorded on the front just since the beginning of the day, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The main focus is on the Kupiansk and POKROVSK directions. And for more details about the situation on the front line, stay tuned.
In the Kupiansk direction, Ukrainian National Guard soldiers destroyed a Type 75 multiple-launch rocket system of North Korean manufacture. The system was detected by operators from the unmanned systems units of the 15th Rapid Response Brigade Korodak. They shared footage of their combat operations online. At the same time, the Institute for the Study of War has determined that on average Russian troops lose about 1.5 dozen soldiers daily in attacks on the Lyman direction. About 15 servicemen are lost each day in assaults on the Lyman axis. Analysts note that Russian army soldiers there are fighting a war of attrition. They are still wearing summer uniforms and have meager rations. Russian units are also plagued by low morale, and the soldiers have far too little equipment. Despite ongoing attacks, there has been no confirmed progress by Russian forces in key directions.
Undoubtedly, after the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration, the hottest spot is not even the Kostiantinivka area. At the moment, it's Kupiansk. It's the northern front of Kupiansk. The Kupiansk salient, where the Russians are also using a very similar tactic to the one they employ in the Pokrovsk direction. This shows that it's not a coincidence, it's a system. Due to changing weather conditions, the Russians are now forced to use mechanized assaults much more often, knowing that again, these are one-off actions. They have no other options.
In the Kostiantinivka direction, over the past day, the enemy attempted assault operations in the areas of Sherbinivka, Pleshevka, Toretsk and Sofiivka. In the Pokrovsk sector, where about half of all fighting on the front is taking place, Russian invaders tried to push back Ukrainian defenders. Near Nikonorivka, Rodinske, Kotlin, Molodetske, Novopavlivka, Novoekonomishne and Mirnohrad. And in the Oleksandrivka area, the defense forces repelled attacks near the settlements of Verbove, Pavlivka, and in the direction of Arestopol, Ribne, and Alexeyevka.
That incursion, which occurred in the Dobropilia direction, specifically to the north of Pokrovsk, was an event that created, and still, even now, it potentially poses a very serious and significant threat to the rear of our Kostiantinivka-Druzhkivka group of forces. However, this threat has been practically and almost completely eliminated by the actions and efforts of the armed forces. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, it must be acknowledged that it was in fact a mistake. It was clearly a Russian mistake. The 51st Army tried to advance in 2 directions. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, but it was simply too much to handle.
The Russian invaders also attempted an assault in the Zaporizhzhia direction. To create an element of surprise, they used motorcycles. However, they were spotted by drone operators from the Ronin's unit of the 65th Separate Mechanized Brigade. With precise drone strikes, they destroyed 11 motorcycles and at least 1 invader. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces destroyed the latest Russian Buk surface-to-air missile system and the Nebo-U radar station in the Rostov region. Both systems, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, have been completely disabled. The Bukom 3 can engage aerial targets at distances of up to 80 kilometers, while the Nebo-U can detect aerial targets at ranges of up to 400 kilometers. Russian occupiers are dismantling decommissioned trucks in Sevastopol to make up for equipment losses. Partisans from the Atesh movement have discovered the exact coordinates of the warehouses, and an analysis of satellite images showed that since the beginning of April this year, dozens of decommissioned trucks have been towed from there, including fire engines based on ZIL trucks. All the collected information has already been handed over by the partisans to the Ukrainian Defense Forces for prompt action. And in the past 24 hours, Ukrainian defense forces have eliminated 970 Russian occupiers. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia's total combat losses since the start of the full-scale war have almost reached 1,141,000 people. In addition, the day before, the defense forces destroyed 5 Russian tanks, 5 armored vehicles, and 39 artillery systems. They also burned 2 Russian multiple rocket launch systems, 1 air defense system, and 118 units of enemy vehicles and special equipment.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the coordination of new sanctions against Russia. According to him, the restrictions will target the military-industrial complex of the aggressor country and its financial sources. Volodymyr Zelensky also noted that Ukraine and its partners will work to reduce the import of energy resources from the Russian Federation. Russian losses from sanctions against oil companies alone could reach $50 billion as early as next year.
Today we have new sanction decisions of our own. More than 50 people, mainly Russian citizens, are involved. They work for Russia's war against Ukraine, for the Russian military industry, and also for propaganda. Of course, we will share our sanction decisions with partner states as well, so that they support this entirely justified pressure on Russia for the war. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine has also carried out preparatory work to synchronize the 19th EU sanctions package within our jurisdiction. And the Europeans are already preparing the 20th sanctions package. We have presented a proposal to our partners and held a coordination meeting. Here is the summary of sanctions for this year. Together with the Security Service of Ukraine, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country, and the Foreign Intelligence Service, we have identified the key objectives that must be achieved by the end of the year regarding the Russian tanker fleet, Russian energy companies, and all those enterprises and entities that help sustain the Russian military industry. It is important that our partners take our arguments into account when preparing their pressure measures.
The United States canceled President Donald Trump's meeting in Budapest with the dictator Putin. This happened after Russia made demands regarding Ukraine. This was reported by the Financial Times. Sources of the publication claim that Moscow's position was too tough and this did not satisfy Washington. It is also reported that the decision to cancel the previously planned bilateral summit was made after a tense phone conversation at the highest diplomatic level. At the same time, the aide to the Russian dictator Ushakov stated that Russia maintains what they call a principled readiness to hold a summit with the United States of America, which in their view has been postponed indefinitely. The Kremlin is not actually seeking peace, but is merely looking for ways to continue the war. This was stated by the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Georgy Tikhy. According to him, Putin must stop the war. When Moscow is ready, a meeting of the leaders can be held and a ceasefire can be agreed upon. This year, the Ukrainian delegation traveled to Istanbul several times for direct talks with the Russian delegation. Unfortunately, what they saw there was a group of low-level officials making the same old ultimatums and lacking the authority to resolve any issues. The reason is simple. Putin is not seeking peace. He is looking for ways to continue the war. Georgy Tikhy, spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, social media IKS. Ukraine, together with its partners, is developing a peace plan to end the war. Work on the document is ongoing. This was reported by the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. There are no alternative plans, Andriy Yermak emphasized. Meanwhile, Russia has declared its readiness to continue negotiations with Ukraine. According to Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin, supposedly all the conditions exist for the development of the Istanbul negotiation track. My colleague, Kristina Dombrovskaya, will continue on this topic.
The information about alleged multiple peace plans to end Russia's war against Ukraine from the US, the European Union, or other countries does not correspond to reality, reported the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. It is about joint work between Kyiv and its partners on a single document, Andriy Yermak emphasized. They plan to discuss it in detail on November 3rd during the continuation of the coalition meeting of those willing at the level of national security advisors.
There, we will discuss all ideas to synchronize our positions and develop further steps. This is not about competition or separate initiatives. It's about finding synergy between Ukraine, the EU, the US, and other partners. Of course, the participation of the US is fundamental. The President of Ukraine is constantly in contact with all the leaders of partner countries. The war continues right here. Ukraine is the one facing aggression. Therefore, the final configuration of the plan regarding the parameters of the peace agreement will be up to us. This is a matter of justice and common sense. Andriy Yermak, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, in a comment to RBC Ukraine.
The presidents of Ukraine, the United States, and European leaders are convinced that any negotiations must begin with a ceasefire. The head of the Office of the President of Ukraine stated that all of Kyiv's partners agree that for diplomats to work successfully, the fighting must be stopped. The plan that Ukraine is developing together with its partners will serve as the basis for further diplomatic steps, President Volodymyr Zelensky explained during a meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands.
This is not a plan to end the war because, as you know, a ceasefire is needed first and foremost. Let's put it this way. This is a plan from which diplomacy begins, and in principle, it is the main one. I understand perfectly well, and everyone understands that after a ceasefire, if there are strong security guarantees regarding Russia, it will be very difficult to resume aggression. That is why this plan is more or less focused on that. According to
Bloomberg, the document that Ukraine and its partners are working on consists of 12 points. It stipulates that after the ceasefire, Russia will be obliged to return all illegally deported Ukrainian children. The parties will exchange prisoners of war. Ukraine will receive security guarantees, funding for reconstruction, and an accelerated path to joining the European Union. According to the agency's sources, the implementation of the proposed plan could be undertaken by a commission chaired by U.S. President Donald Trump.
The details of the plan are still being finalized and may change. Any proposal will also require approval from Washington. European officials may travel to the U.S. this week, sources told Bloomberg.
Europe is ready to meet Ukraine's financial and military needs for 2026 and 2027, assured European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, speaking at the 77th session of the Nordic Council in Stockholm. This platform brings together the parliaments of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland.
The European Council has committed to covering Ukraine's financial needs for 2026 and 2027, whether these are military requirements or, if necessary, budgetary ones. We are prepared for a long-term struggle. We are ready to cover Ukraine's financial needs to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Meanwhile, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin stated that Russia is allegedly ready to continue negotiations with Ukraine, but exclusively on the basis of the so-called memorandum that the Russian delegation handed over to the Ukrainian side in Istanbul. This list of ultimatums from Moscow is absolutely unacceptable to Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said this in June 2025. And the Kremlin understands this perfectly well. All of this is just part of Putin's strategy to prolong the war. It was precisely because of such an ultimatum-driven stance from Moscow that the meeting between Donald Trump and Putin in Budapest fell through, according to journalists from the Financial Times. Kristina Dombrovskaya for Freedom TV channel.
A group of children and teenagers from the Novo-Petrovsk Special School in the Mykolaiv region has been returned to Ukraine. They were deported to Russia at the beginning of the full-scale military invasion. This was reported by the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak. The young Ukrainians, among whom were orphans and children deprived of parental care, were forcibly taken through temporarily occupied Crimea to Anapa. They are now safe. U.S. President Donald Trump refused to exempt Hungary from sanctions on Russian oil. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán had requested this from him. However, as Trump noted while speaking to journalists aboard his plane, even though they are supposedly on good terms, he will not lift the sanctions. Nevertheless, Viktor Orbán is hoping for a successful visit to Washington next week. Washington's energy sanctions and the possible holding of a U.S.-Russia summit in Budapest are the two main issues Orbán intends to discuss with U.S. President Donald Trump. This was reported by the head of the Hungarian Prime Minister's office. Orbán himself stated that he intends to sign a broad economic agreement with the United States to offset the impact of American tariffs. Kristina Dombrovskaya will continue on this topic.
The goal of Budapest is to obtain an exemption from U.S. sanctions so that the purchase of Russian gas and crude oil can continue in a stable manner, said the head of the Hungarian Prime Minister's office. Earlier, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stated that at the meeting with Donald Trump, they plan to discuss the restrictions imposed by the U.S. Treasury. These concern the largest Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft.
This game is not over yet. Sanctions against some Russian oil companies are indeed in effect. We are working on ways to bypass these sanctions.
Hungary opposes the European Union's policy of a complete rejection of Russian energy resources and does not intend to diversify its supplies. After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Budapest not only refused to give up fuel from the Federation, but on the contrary, increased imports from 61% to 86%. Such dependence on Russia poses a serious risk for Hungary, analysts believe. Especially now, after the United States imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, as well as their subsidiaries. The American decision states that all organizations that are 50% or more owned, directly or indirectly, by these two companies must be blocked.
If no solution is found, all of this will have to stop within a few weeks. Again, this means a reduction in the Kremlin's revenues and likely a minor fuel crisis for Hungary and Slovakia.
The Hungarian government is trying to convince Washington that due to its geographical location, Budapest has no alternatives to supplies from Russia. The White House, however, does not seem to believe these arguments. The U.S. representative to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, advised Orban's government to work on plans to phase out Russian energy resources.
President Trump is very disappointed with Putin and his refusal to end the war or even to take constructive steps in that direction. And so the next obvious step for President Trump was to continue putting pressure on Russia to stop the killing and put an end to this senseless war. That is why we will continue to work with Hungary and some other NATO allies to wean them off Russian oil and gas, and at the same time make sure that they are buying oil and gas from allies from countries like the United States.
Orban is criticized in NATO and the EU not only for his pro-Moscow economic policies, but also for his Euroscepticism and demonstrative displays of friendship with Putin. Lately, it seems Viktor Orban has been captivated by Moscow, and now he believes that it is better to build an authoritarian model following Russia's example, said the Prime Minister of Poland. He added that for Orban, power is a means to ensure that no one can control the actions of those in power. And the result, according to Donald Tusk, is obvious.
Hungary was far ahead of Poland in 1989, but now it is the poorest country in the European Union. Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of Poland, from a publication in The Guardian.
According to the Hungarian Foreign Minister, Viktor Orban and Donald Trump will meet next week. In the meantime, Budapest is planning to assess the exact impact of American sanctions on Hungary's economy, noted Peter Szijjártó. The Hungarian government does not have much time to make a decision. The U.S. Treasury Department's restrictions against Rosneft and Lukoil will take effect on November 21st. According to the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, during this period, the two Russian oil giants must sell their European businesses and cease supplying oil to their customers on the continent. Otherwise, they face significant fines.